It's been a weird and honestly disappointing winter here. After a really dry November and first half of December, it basically dumped nonstop for about 3 weeks through Christmas and into early January. We were getting our sleds stuck, skiing deep powder, sometimes even cold light powder. And since then, in the past 2 months, it snowed about 2 feet total. And during that time, we've had not only long dry spells, but weird wind and multiple rain events. The good news is that once again, we've had a safe snowpack, relatively speaking. There have been no long-term instabilities, no facets, no problem layers buried under the pack. Mostly, it's been a season of mitigating risks related to crusts, rain crusts, sun crusts, scoured faces. And this weekend was the trickiest of all. It rained Tuesday and Wednesday. And on Thursday, the temperatures dropped, and we got about 4 inches of snow. And while that snow was falling and then picking up Friday and Saturday, winds were blowing pretty hard, stealing it from some faces, some surfaces, depositing it, loading it, forming it into a slab in others. Now, typically, our winds blow from the coast across the Cascades from the west to the east, loading typically the east faces, leaving the west slopes scoured, often covered with rime. And because we're in the northern hemisphere, the north sides of the mountains are typically shaded throughout most of the day, rarely get warm enough to melt, while the south faces are in the sun, exposed, and go through repeated cycles of melting, refreezing, melting, refreezing. So our typical pattern is the north and the east aspects are where typical avalanche hazards lie, of wind slabs, and if there are any permanent slab issues, typically in the north and northeast. In the south and west is when we deal with the safer situations, but typically worse skiing. Now this last storm was all backward. The winds blew out of the north toward the south, wind loading the faces that are typically scoured and scouring just about everything else. The local avalanche forecast for the day I went out, on Sunday, was green top to bottom. Low avalanche risk at all elevations. Now, the hazard that existed was wind slabs on southern faces. Because there wasn't a ton of snow, they'd be small, very unlikely to reach anything over a foot in depth. Most likely smaller, and most likely limited to small pockets rather than widespread, slope-wide slabs. And importantly, the forecasters from their observations believed that over Friday and Saturday, this new snow appeared to be bonding relatively well to the crust layer from the rain underneath it. Now, my day and my experiences would prove that wrong, but that's just how this stuff goes. The question, with all these layers of ice and crust all season, has been how well the new snow will bond to those layers, when it will bond, if it's bonded everywhere or if some places are more secure than others. So, I knew that the one risk was wind slab avalanches on south-facing aspects. But the overall risk was low because any avalanches from those wind slabs would be relatively small and in limited pockets. And according to the center, they thought those avalanches would also be highly unlikely. Knowing this, I decided to go out exploring on my own. Now, wind slabs pose a paradox because the same areas, the same aspects and elevations and terrain like gullies and couloirs that allow the wind to load up 2, 3, 4 times as much snow as there is in other places, and then to beat that snow into a hard slab. Well, surprise, those are also the places where you find snow that's fun to ski. And especially a day like today, almost everywhere you traveled, because of the rain, there was slick ice, crazy wind formations, patches between snow and ice, whole fields of ice. Most faces had very unfun snow. And the only pockets, for the most part, of soft, fresh snow were where the wind had deposited it on those south faces. So, facing wind slab, you're always posed with a challenge. Either go look for that wind-deposited snow and watch, manage, mitigate your risks of wind slab avalanches, or hope that there's good snow in non-wind loaded places, which, when there's a nice storm and there's lots of fresh snow, that's easy enough to do. In the kind of season we've had, that's been nearly impossible. So, I knew the avalanche risks. I went out exploring. I went to a new area, somewhat adjacent to where we often ski, but in search of some new terrain. Looking back on the day, I think I made some good decisions and some bad decisions. And here's some of what I learned. Okay. This is my first time ever skiing this ridge, broken hand. Found some patches of soft snow, but it is pretty thin, so I'm dearly hoping I don't hit any rocks on the way down. And if I do, I'm hoping I can stop myself before it gets too ugly. But the snow does look pretty good in here. Oh. This is a shooting crack. It means that the slope that I'm standing on is formed into a slab, and that slab just sheared all the way across the chute. It didn't slide yet, but what I could tell and feel and look around the snow was that all of the slope I was standing on was ready to let go of that crust layer at any minute. Maybe not all together in one big slab, but piece by piece, which, even if it didn't knock me down, would leave me standing on a layer of ice. Okay. I need to bail on this. The real problem here is not that I was at any risk of getting buried in an avalanche. It's that I got greedy, and for the first line of the day, I tried to get an extra few turns by boot packing up above a large section of exposed lava rock, requiring me to ski down above that rock, keep on my skis, make sure I don't fall, and then traverse across into the slope with a clean run out. Okay, I'm gonna cut across this here. Alright, this was a mistake. My exit is just through there, which then it's clear. It's just these rocks below me. Oh, Tim. All right, this is the trickiest. All right, one jump turn. That wasn't worth the risk, for sure. For sure. I don't think any of that was like fatal risk, but those rocks are a meat grinder, so that would not have been fun. I should have just skipped the top half and just got my, what did I get, 4 turns? Well, I just rode my first wind slab. Totally fine. I was booting up, starting to go up this little mini couloir, and I rode it down on my knees. Basically right where I was. It didn't go far enough for the snow to pile up at all. We just slid down about 40-50 feet. You can see it's kind of the middle of it. It's thinner onlookers left there and thicker in the gully where the snow compiled. And my last line, well, the only line I've skied on Broken Hand, it wasn't a slab like this, but it was, this whole top layer was sliding out as soon as I stepped on it. I knew the only real risk today was if you got into big steep terrain trap or getting over a cliff or rocks where I couldn't control myself. So it's just not big slabs out here. There's not a lot of snow in this concern area, but man, that's a crazy feeling. I've never slid down a cracking slab of snow before. I mean, any one of these chunks, you know, as heavy as me. So, if it had been steeper and started to compile, or if there had been a gully like that thing over there, that could have been trouble. Desperately trying to find any snow out here because it's just the ice bowl everywhere. And you find a little bit of real snow and I get to ride a little avalanche. And of course now it's unskiable. Weird times. After that, I sat down and took a nice long lunch break. And while I did, across from me, on the east face of one of the bigger mountains, I watched 2 people crampon up a really steep line. And you can tell part of what they're climbing over is bare patches where the snow had already slid off. Now, this is an east face, and you can tell even just by looking at it that the risk isn't a wind slab. The risk is just icy conditions. So I admit, watching them climb, I thought what they were doing was maybe a little stupid, at least not something I would have risked. Mainly just being scared to take a really long, out-of-control slide. But seeing as I had just managed to avoid nearly setting off one avalanche and then rode a second avalanche down, I wasn't really in any position to judge. Turns out, they ended up getting a pretty sweet line. Where I took a slide. May go without saying, but I gave up on skiing any south faces after all that. I started skiing out, hoping that by this time of day, some of the ice crust had begun to soften just enough to be able to make some turns. You get avalanches, or you get this. On the way out, I stopped and skied one of our normal bowls. Alright, the mystery face. We're about to see how much of this is soft snow and how much is ice. Now for the mogul run. That was actually pretty fun. Okay, so looking back on it, the one decision I regret is that first run, putting myself above those rocks. Because the reality is, the risk this day wasn't burial. Not at least if I made the decision, which I did, to avoid any big, huge south-facing slopes with any terrain traps. If I did that, like I did on the second run, even if I broke a slab off and started an avalanche, there wasn't a real chance I was going to get buried. So I'm happy, actually, with my decision on the second run. I knew that was okay. I didn't want it to break. I didn't want to get caught in an avalanche at all. I didn't want to risk losing a ski, getting hurt, twisting an ankle, any of that. But I picked a piece of terrain that wasn't going to threaten my life. On the first run, however, I stepped right into the risk of the day, which was the risk of injury. Either getting knocked down by a chunk of a slab breaking off, losing my footing when the snow breaks out from under me, or having all the actual snow disappear on me to be left on a steep sheet of ice, all above either rocks or a cliff, some sort of exposure. It wasn't huge, it wasn't a cliff, it wasn't a fatal risk, but I would have gotten really beat up if I had taken a bad fall up on top. And the reality is, I did it all just to get about maybe 4 extra turns. So I regret that. I'm glad I made it out. I think it was a bad decision, and I think I only didn't get hurt because I got lucky. I'm actually okay with my decision, like I said, on the second run, the one that broke and actually avalanched. But I also realized, after watching that other group ski the east face and getting a few turns on one of the buttes on the way out, that all that nasty ice face, if I was just more patient, it actually did soften up, and it was pretty dang fun. Not all time, not powder, nothing to scream and write home about, but it was a good time. So, lastly, I think I learned a little bit of lesson about the human factor. I'm actually okay with my decision to ski alone. I think I made relatively good decisions, like I said, outside of that one mistake on the first run. But I was thoughtful about how to ski alone on a day like that. The bigger issue is that after 2 months of disappointment, with half of January, all of February, and nearly half of March seemingly wasting away without any good powder days, I basically was just overzealous. It feels like winter's almost over, like I'm almost out of weekends, out of time to play in real snow. And I guess that kind of anxiety makes you do dumb shit. I didn't want to ride barely thawed out ice. I wanted to ride snow. So I did. Except that snow wasn't safe. Well, not safe enough. Anyway, I think that's what I learned.